In this clip, we will cover the mechanics for reaction, which is one of the more important parts of this game system. During the reaction step of any enemy hasty attack or assault operation, the inactive player has the option to reinforce his units in the objective hex, unless enemy jamming has eliminated that option. There must be at least one friendly unit in the objective hex, meaning that it's proved to be real, and there can be no masked units present because masked units block reaction. The inactive player can move all maneuver units in one stack, meaning all the units in one hex, into the objective hex if they meet all the conditions for reaction. No unit can enter the objective hex in violation of stacking restrictions. This is one of the few times in this game when a player cannot voluntarily violate stacking restrictions. To react, a unit must be unused, located within 3 hexes of the objective hex, and not located adjacent to an enemy unit. It must be able to enter the objective hex by spending no more than 3 movement points, or it is not allowed to react at all. A reacting unit cannot use road movement, but it can take advantage of a special rule for reaction that allows a unit to enter any hex along a road for just 1 movement point. So, if there's a road present, it can move through a hex for 1 movement point, all inclusive. A reacting unit cannot move adjacent to an enemy unit at any point during its movement, except to enter the objective hex itself, or if it is entering a hex that is protected. You might want to look at case 16.3 for that. However, as an exception to normal rules, a unit can react into the objective hex and therefore move adjacent to enemy units without being located within 3 hexes of a lead unit marker. Reaction works differently for each player, meaning for each alliance. The Warsaw Pact player can only react with units if they are planned for a reserve operation, and then only if the objective hex contains a unit from the same regiment. As an exception, units from the Divisional Tank Battalion, a special formation present only in Soviet motor rifle divisions, can react into an objective hex containing any unit from the same division or any base units in the chain of command of that division, if they are not stacked with units from a different division. The Divisional Tank Battalion was the division commander's personal reserve and therefore has a lot more flexibility than a standard regiment. Moving to NATO, the NATO player can react any units in one stack into an objective hex if they all belong to the same brigade and that brigade has a unit in the objective hex, or if all the units in the objective hex belong to base units in that brigade's chain of command and they are the same nationality as that brigade. So in effect, NATO can react units within a brigade to reinforce other units within that brigade, or to reinforce hexes that are base units in their chain of command. The NATO player has an additional requirement for reaction. He must expend a command point from the brigade HQ superior to the reacting units in order to order that reaction. The brigade HQ could also channel a command point from any superior division HQ to order that reaction. However, off-map command points can never be spent for reaction because they are too far up the chain of command to react that quickly. All right, let's take a look at an example. So here we see the 174th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment, and it is conducting a hasty attack against the Bradley Company and the engineer unit in the objective hex. The Warsaw Pact player made a jamming attempt, but it failed to block any reaction. It is now the reaction step of the operation, and the NATO player is considering his options. He could react this Bradley unit here into the hex, and it would go 1, 2 movement points and would have no problem getting there. He could react these 2 Abrams companies in this hex into the objective hex. Now, normally he would be blocked because a unit that is reacting is not allowed to use road movement, and so this heavy woods hex here would cost the 3 movement points the unit is allowed for reaction just enter that 1 hex all by itself. However, we do have this special rule that says that a reacting unit can enter a hex along a road for just 1 movement point, which means that the Abrams unit could go 1, 2, 3, and into the objective hex, so that would work. The NATO player only gets to react with units from 1 hex, so he's got to choose which of these 2 units he reacts with. However, if both of these units started in the same hex, then they would be in a stack, and the NATO player would be legally allowed to react with 1 or both of these units. So it would be possible for both of these units to go 1, 2, 3 and react into this hex. The reacting units contain 3 steps of maneuver units. We only have 1 step of maneuver units in the objective hex, the Bradley, and therefore the reaction of all of these units here would bring the total number of maneuver units in this hex up to 4, which is within the legal stacking limits. However, this is not the actual situation, so the NATO player is still going to have to be choosing which one. There are a couple of nuances that are worth considering here. One is, let's just presume for the sake of argument that this BTR unit had made it to here. In this case, no reaction is possible because a reacting unit cannot move adjacent to an enemy unit except in the objective hex. So effectively what the Soviet player has done here is he's cut off this unit from reaction if he'd been able to get this unit here, in the event he didn't actually get the unit here. However, another thing that would also be true is if this Soviet unit had made it to here, no reaction would be possible because both of these units are now adjacent to an enemy unit, and anybody who is adjacent to an enemy unit is not allowed to react. Alright, so in the event the NATO player decides that he's going to react with his Abrams unit, so he spends a command point from his brigade headquarters. This would actually be tracked on the HQ track for that 1st of the 3rd Brigade, but in Vassal we have this ability to decrement the actual unit counter, so we expend that command point to order this guy to react, and in he goes. Units that react into the objective hex get to participate in defensive fire. However, there is a cost. As soon as a unit reacts into the objective hex, it and all units already present in that hex are immediately flipped to their used side if not already there. So in this case, the Abrams comes racing up here to reinforce this attack. It has to flip, and so do all the other units in the hex. They will not be available for any other operations. They are pinned in this combat. The second cost for reaction is that the inactive player cannot elect to retreat from an objective hex that he has just reacted into. Therefore, all hits inflicted by enemy offensive fire must be absorbed by step loss. So the advantage here is this Abrams unit is going to get to execute defensive fire. The disadvantage is the units that started in that hex have to stay there and hold the hex long enough for the Abrams unit to get there, so nobody's retreating. Alright, so the unit reacts into the hex, and play proceeds to the defensive fire step. The NATO player chooses to focus all of his defensive fire on this BTR unit in the open. So he takes a look at the fire effects chart, and he determines that his Bradley step and his engineers are doubled for occupying close terrain in an objective hex, so collectively they become a 10. And he also determines that his Abrams unit is halved for firing out of close terrain hex, the town here, and therefore the 2 9s there become a single 9. So effectively we've got 10 and 9 for 19. After the standard division by 2, 19 becomes 9. So we're going in with 9 hits. We consult the CRT and roll a die. The die is a 4, which means that the NATO player has inflicted 9 minus 1 hit for 8 hits. The Warsaw Pact player is going to have to absorb 2 steps of loss. absorb those 8 hits, and that's the end of defensive fire. Next, the Warsaw Pact player gets to fire back, and so in this case he's going to fire with a grand total of 6 steps. 6 times an attack strength of 3 is 18. 18 is halved to 9 by the standard division by 2, so the Warsaw Pact player has an effective fire strength of 9. He consults the CRT and rolls the die, and he receives a 7, which means that he has inflicted a grand total of 10 hits. As always with fire combat, the strongest unit has to take losses, and no hits can be applied to any other units in the hex until the strongest unit is gone. But the 10 hits here are just enough to claim one of the Abrams steps, because it's got a printed defense strength of 9, and it receives +1 for being in cover. So the Abrams unit loses a step without the option to retreat, and that ends the operation. Let's take a look at reaction for the Warsaw Pact player. So we will scroll down to another situation. In this example, the Warsaw Pact player has planned a reserve operation for the 244th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment with units in this hex, and this hex. The NATO player has the initiative, and he has activated the 35th Panzer Grenadier Brigade. The brigade launches a hasty attack against the unit here. So these units come rolling up here to make this attack without going through the full panoply of steps. When we get to the reaction step of this hasty attack operation, the Warsaw Pact player would have a choice of reacting this unit here or this unit here. Both of them can move 3 hexes into the objective hex, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3. The regiment is eligible for reaction because it is planned for a reserve operation, and in this event the Warsaw Pact player decides that he is going to react this unit in 1, 2, 3. I won't actually execute the defensive and offensive fire, but you get the basic principle that this was a legal reaction. If later in the turn the NATO player declared another hasty attack operation against this same hex, and he were to move these units in, this unit here would still be eligible to react. So in that case, the Warsaw Pact player could then react this unit in as well and execute additional defensive fire against the attacking units here. Alright, we mentioned that the Warsaw Pact player has a special formation in his Soviet motor rifle divisions, and that is the Divisional Tank Battalion. So this unit is allowed to react into any hex containing only units subordinate to the same division, and is also allowed to react into any hex containing base units that are in the division's chain of command. So if later in this turn the NATO player had activated the US 2nd of the 3rd and declared that he was launching a hasty attack against these units here, which are an artillery unit and an engineer from the 8th Guards Army, so that becomes the objective hex, and these units march up here to take a crack at them. The Warsaw Pact player would have the option at this point of reacting this guy in 1, 2, 3, because it's planned for a reserve operation. It can reach the hex without moving adjacent to an enemy unit, and it is eligible to reinforce units in its chain of command, which the 8th Guards Army base units certainly are. One thing to point out here is that there is no requirement that any of these units started within 3 hexes of a friendly Lee unit marker, even though they are moving adjacent to enemy units. Another thing that is worth mentioning is that when a player is playing in hidden mode, there are some additional restrictions on reaction. A player is allowed to react more maneuver unit counters into the objective hex than the stacking restrictions allow, as long as the player knows that the maneuver unit counter limit can be observed at the end of that reaction movement by consolidating steps. so you can temporarily overstack, but only because you're going to fix it at the end of that movement. However, a player is never allowed to reveal more steps in the objective hex, more maneuver unit steps than he is permitted. Any excess maneuver unit steps that appear as a result of a revelation die roll are immediately returned to the step pool. On the other hand, if all reacting units turn out to be dummies, then the units in the objective hex are still flipped to their used side and cannot retreat, despite the fact that they didn't actually get reinforced, because they were holding the hex in expectation of that reinforcement. Alright, that covers virtually all the nuances for reaction, and so we terminate this clip.